The old asylum had always been a place of whispering rumors and forgotten secrets. Hidden deep in the woods, away from prying eyes of the city, it stood like a dark sentinel against the horizon. Built in the late 1800s, it had originally been designed as a haven for those suffering from mental disorders. But over the years, it became a place of dread, a place where fear and madness festered like an infection. At the heart of this nightmare was Dr. Vincent Caldwell, the asylum's chief physician. Tall, thin, and with a face that looked as though it had never seen the light of joy. Dr. Caldwell had earned a reputation not for curing his patients, but for his brutal methods of treatment. The asylum staff often spoke of his unnerving obsession with uncovering the hidden recesses of the human mind, but the whispers that made their way through the hallways were far more disturbing. Dr. Caldwell was a man of science, but his science was warped. His experiments, often unapproved and unregulated, were conducted under the cover of night. No one dared question him, not the nurses, not the orderlies, not even the other doctors. The asylum was a place where the boundaries between sanity and insanity were blurred, and Dr. Caldwell blurred them even further. It began with his obsession with lobotomies. He believed that by severing the connections in the brain, he could rid patients of their madness. But what he didn't realize, or perhaps did, was that these procedures didn't cure anyone. They only made them more docile, more broken. The patients who survived were little more than empty shells, their personalities and memories ripped away. But lobotomies were only the beginning. As time passed, Caldwell's experiments grew darker. He began injecting his patients with unknown substances that caused horrific side effects, uncontrolled spasms, violent rages, and in some cases, death. He would watch with cold detachment as his patients writhed in agony, recording every moment for his research. If they died, it was a small price to pay for his pursuit of knowledge. He would simply bury them in shallow graves in the basement, their bodies quickly forgotten beneath the cold earth. The other doctors turned a blind eye to Caldwell's actions, fearful of the man's power and influence in the asylum. They knew something was wrong, but they feared what would happen if they spoke out. It was easier to pretend they didn't hear the screams, to ignore the strange, unholy sounds that echoed through the asylum's night. Those sounds, soft, low moans that seemed to seep from the walls themselves, were becoming more frequent. Some said they were the spirits of the patients who had died under Caldwell's cruel hands, their souls unable to find peace. Others believed it was something worse, something that grew stronger with each passing night. But the worst part of the asylum was not the screams, nor the moans, nor the hollow-eyed patients who wandered its halls like lost souls. The worst part was that those who heard the moans, those who were foolish enough to listen, were never the same again. It started with small signs. A nurse might have seen something move out of the corner of her eye, only to turn and find nothing was there. An orderly might have felt a cold hand brush against his shoulder, but when he looked, there was no one behind him. And then, slowly, they began to hear it, the moans. Soft, mournful sounds that seemed to come from deep within the walls. Sometimes it was just like a whisper, barely audible to the hum of the fluorescent lights. Other times, it was loud, unmistakable, a cacophony of desperate voices. Dr. Caldwell was the first to notice the change. His staff, once so loyal, began to act strangely. Nurses would pause in the middle of their rounds, staring blankly at the walls as if they were listening to something just beyond hearing. Orderlies began to whisper amongst themselves, their faces pale and drawn, as if the very air in the asylum was becoming suffocating. But it was when Dr. Caldwell found one of his fellow doctors, Dr. Pierce, in the middle of the hallway, staring at nothing with a vacant look in his eyes, that he realized something was terribly wrong. Dr. Pierce's skin was ashen, his eyes wide with terror. He was muttering to himself, his words unintelligible. When Caldwell approached, Pierce's gaze locked onto him, and in a voice that was barely a whisper, he said, "They're still here, in the walls, in the floors. They never left." Dr. Caldwell didn't understand, but what he did next would become the catalyst for his own unraveling. He ordered Pierce to be restrained and sent to the isolation ward, but the damage had already been done. Word spread quickly, and soon, more and more of his staff began to show the same symptoms. Nurses were found wandering the halls at night, their eyes wide and empty, unable to remember how they had gotten there. Orderlies started refusing to go near the basement, claiming they could hear the moans of the dead calling to them, begging for release. One night, as the moon hung high in the sky, Caldwell stood in front of the basement door, his mind racing. He had never believed in ghosts, never believed in the supernatural, but something in the air tonight was different. The moans, they were louder than ever, like a constant thrum that shook the very foundation of the building. Driven by an insatiable curiosity, Caldwell descended into the basement, his footsteps echoing in the darkness. As he reached the far corner, where the old, unmarked graves lie beneath the floorboards, the air grew colder. His breath came out in visible puffs, and the walls seemed to pulse with the sound of moans, distant, tortured, like 1,000 souls crying out in agony. Caldwell could feel his heart race, but he couldn't stop it now. He had to know. He had to understand. He knelt beside one of the graves, his hand trembling as he brushed aside the dirt. Beneath the earth, he could feel something. Something that was not quite human, yet not quite animal. A cold, clammy hand gripped his wrist, and before he could react, a voice filled his mind, not with words, but with an overwhelming sense of dread and despair. "You should never have listened." Caldwell tried to pull away, but it was too late. The grip tightened, and the moans grew louder, more frantic. In that moment, he understood. The asylum was alive, feeding on the pain and suffering of its inhabitants. The souls of the dead were not at rest. They were trapped here, bound by the twisted experiments of a mad doctor, and now they had come for him. When the staff found Caldwell the next morning, he was sitting in his office, staring blankly at the wall. His eyes were wide, his skin pale, and his mind shattered. He mumbled incoherently about the voices, about the souls that had never left, and as they watched him descend into madness, they heard it. The soft, sorrowful moans coming from the walls, the floors, and the very air itself. And they knew it wasn't over. The asylum had claimed another soul, and it would never stop.